In this tutorial we'll have a look at how you can use Nuke's 3D system to assist with traditional tasks such as rig removal. So let's have a quick look at the shot. And as you can see, as the camera pulls back, there's a whole lot of rig, as in dolly tracks, that need to be removed. And we'll just use a simple projection technique followed by a UV unwrap technique to help with that. So let's have a look. I've already tracked the camera using Nuke's upcoming 3D tracker. So that's this guy here. And that gave us our match move camera as well as a point cloud that I could use to align my ground plane. And that's pretty much the only two components we need from that setup. So I'll just pinch the camera and the card. And now let's have a look at the plate again. So a common approach to painting out tracks like this would be just grabbing one of the frames where you see most of the rig, cleaning that up, and then projecting it through a static camera to rephotograph the whole thing through your shot camera. However, if you do that and start with a static frame here, you obviously will be stuck with all the grain that is in the plate. So let's have a look at an alternative approach. Instead of just grabbing the last frame, I'm going to project the whole plate through the animated camera. So let's grab a projection shader and apply that to our card. So now we've got this, and you can see as we move through time, our texture will update to show the respective frame at that time. So if you have a closer look at the dolly tracks, for example, as the camera moves through space, the tracks stay exactly in the same position because the camera has been matched to it. So this setup effectively supplies us with a 3D stabilized plate. And now we want to render the whole thing, but we don't want to render it through any camera. What we want to do, we want to simply take this card and peel it from 3D space into 2D space. So we'll unwrap the texture that's on the card based on the card's texture coordinates, which is the UV mode in the render node. And let's have a look at what that gives us. This automatically gets rid of all the perspective distortion, and it kind of paints the whole plate into that texture space. So as we step through time, you'll see how the plate sort of paints itself into the frame if you want. Let's have another look at this UV thing. Back in the 3D viewer, I'll go to the viewer settings and to the 3D tab and activate the point UV mode. This will show us a whole bunch of blue numbers, which are UV coordinates. In the case of the card, it'll start at 0, 0 in the lower left corner and end at 1, 1 in the upper right corner. You can think of UV coordinates a little bit like anchor points that hold a texture in place on a 3D object. So if you look at the lower left corner and the coordinate that you have there is 0, 0, that means that if you unwrap that texture from the object, that pixel that lives at 0, 0 will end up in the lower left corner of our output. Likewise, if you look at the upper right corner and the coordinate 1, 1, the texture that lives at that UV coordinate will end up in our unwrapped frame in the upper right corner. And likewise, all the other coordinates will make sure that the pixels from the geometry will be unwrapped into the correct space in our output frame. And the nice thing about this is, if we now look at, let's say, the last few frames, you see that everything is nice and static except the grain. But since everything else is static, we can now actually go ahead and frame average or frame blend a whole bunch of frames together to get rid of that grain. But instead of trailing 5 frames behind, I just want to blend a static range, and I'm going to give it the last 10 frames of our range. So that's 373 to 382. So now the frame blend node will output a static frame, which is always the result of blending this frame range together. So now if we compare the good old before and after. Here's our degrain, and this is what was before. So it's actually a very, very good improvement. And we can now go ahead and paint out the tracks. And in order to not bore you with simple paint work, I've prepared this earlier just to get rid of the tracks here. It's not a great job, but it'll do for now. Obviously you can use any technique that you like. So once we have this cleaned up texture, all we have to do is assign that to the same exact card that we unwrapped in the first place up here. So I'm going to go to the 3D menu again and use an apply material node to branch off a new tree and assign our cleaned up texture down here. So that gives us our clean texture on the card. We actually don't need the UV display anymore. And if we now log to the render camera, we'll see what we're going to get in our shot. And because we're going to paste this whole thing on top of our plate, we need a more or less reasonable alpha channel as well. So let me just attach a Bezier and just roughly mask out that area where the tracks are. We can always fine-tune that in context of the shot in a little bit, like so. And that goes onto the card, and now we'll use a second scanline renderer, but this time we'll actually render through the shot camera to get our final patch. So that's that. And if we look at the alpha channel, that's here. So all that's left to do is paste the whole thing onto our plate. And I haven't pre-multiplied my texture yet, so I'll just use the matte operation, which will do the pre-multiplication for me. And now we can deactivate that and look at the before and after. Let's check another frame. Yeah, we're getting a bit of edging here, so if we just blur the alpha channel a little bit before it goes onto the card as a texture, that should help get rid of this line. And it's gone. And now the only thing that's left for us to do is actually match the grain. So I'll just pop in a standard grain node. Obviously you'll be using whatever works best for you, and just tweak the grain until it sort of matches, and you're pretty much ready to go. Obviously there's a bit of cleanup work to do yet, but at least you're very quickly in a position where you can fine-tune your clean plate rather than spend a whole day tracking first.